Thank you so much, Professor Rabinbach. And our last speaker before we open it up for discussion today is Professor Olivier Faurlin, who's an Associate Professor of History, a Doctor in Contemporary History and lecturer at the Pierre Mendès France Grenoble 2 University. He is a member of the Center for Research in the History of Italy and the Alpine countries, and his research focuses on the historiography of fascism, the history of intellectuals, Franco-Italian relations in the 20th century. He's the author of many books, including Les intellectuels français et l'Italie, Médiation culturelle, engagement et représentation. I'm massacring the French. L'idée nationale en Italie, du processus d'unification au déchirement de la guerre civile, and Le fascisme, historiographie et enjeux mémoriels, which came out in 2013. I'm going to carry this great obelisk.
Thank you for. I would like to thank the organizer Sky Donné.
You're welcome.
In particular, Sky Donné, Donatello Aramini, and Alessandra Tarquini for inviting me to contribute to the conference. The relevance of the concept of totalitarianism in historical studies on Italian fascism is the subject of intense historiographical debates. Determined by the state of research, the reflection on the question is also influenced by political and memorial context. To study the use of the concept of totalitarianism and research on Italian fascism, I will distinguish three periods. The first is a period of exclusion of fascism from the category of totalitarian regimes between the end of the war till the 1960s, first period, and this first period was followed by a second period marked under the influence of the work of Georges Mosse by his progressive reintegration into the category. However, this is the third period. Criticism of this now dominant trend has not disappeared. First period, the exclusion of Italian fascism from the category of totalitarianism from 1945 until 1960s. At the time, Georges Mosse was invited to present his work at the Stanford Seminar in 1963. The state of reflection on the nature of Italian fascism was far from considering it as a totalitarian regime. Although it has been the regime for which the term totalitarian has been used for the first time in 1923 by Giovanni Amendola, several factors converge to extract it from the category. Three factors. First, the political scientist and philosopher like Franz Borkenau, Franz Neumann, and later Hannah Arendt, who founded scholarly thinking on the concept of totalitarianism, focused their attention on Nazism and Stalinism, excluding Italian fascism from their analysis, particularly because of its absence of mass terror in Italy, in fascist Italy. A second factor concerns the state of the historiography on fascism in Italy, characterized by a hegemony of interpretation stemming from anti-fascism. Rejecting totalitarianism as a Cold War concept, Marxist historians and historians of the liberal socialist current did not recognize its political autonomy nor cultural and ideological autonomy. In this shame, the masses had never supported the regime. Third factor, these readings were reinforced by a collective memory in Italy that distanced the fascist past, what Emilio Gentile calls, I quote Gentile, a retrospective defascization. Clearly, there was a great gap between this historiography and several of them developed by George Mosse. Second period, the gradual reintroduction of fascism among totalitarian regimes. Influenced by the research of George Mosse, which he introduced in Italy, Renzo De Felice revolutionized the historiography of fascism in the mid-1970s by restoring its political and cultural autonomy. Using an approach based on politics and ideology, he brought to light it's well known, the revolutionary dimension of fascism and the consensus of a part of the masses that the regime built around it. However, Renzo De Felice, influenced on this point by Hannah Arendt thesis, tended to exclude the fascist regime from the category of totalitarianism. Indeed, he considered that the compromise made with traditional elites, the depolitization of the fascist party, and its subordination to the state, the process of strengthening Mussolini's power distance it from the totalitarian model. However, in the volume of Mussolini's biography devoted to the years 1936-1940, Renzo De Felice highlighted the totalitarian turn brought by Mussolini to the regime from 1937 and marked by increasing totalitarian control, anti-Semitic laws in 1938. The historian noted, however, that in 1940, the results of this turn, of this change, were disappointing and supported the idea of a failed totalitarianism. It was Emilio Gentile, in particular, who contributed greatly to reintroducing Italian fascism into the category of totalitarian regimes. From his first works, published in the mid-1970s, he favored an approach to fascism through ideology and culture, considered as autonomous phenomena able to explain the adherence of the masses to the fascist regime. He also borrowed from Mosse his conception of ideology not only as a body of doctrine, but also as a set of myths, symbols, beliefs, and rites, as well as a political style based on an appeal to instinct, violence, and the primacy given to action. And Emilio Gentile integrated this conception of ideology, into an interpretation of fascism as totalitarianism. Before to analyze fascism as a totalitarian regime, he developed a definition of totalitarianism inspired on this point by Hannah Arendt, which make it, I quote Emilio Gentile, an experience of political domination implemented by a revolutionary movement and organized by a party with military discipline. He goes on to highlight the interaction between the different elements of totalitarianism, like interaction between a revolutionary party, between conquest of society, between anthropological revolution, etc., which this interaction give totalitarianism the dimension of an experience of continuous domination with its own dynamics. Never completed, the totalitarian process must therefore be understood taking into account the historical context in which it is inscribed. According to Emilio Gentile, Italian fascism fits this pattern. This is a mass revolutionary movement organized into a militarized, hierarchical, and disciplined militia party. Its objectives were to seize the monopoly of power, then to build the totalitarian state, to control, to supervise, and integrate the masses in order to build the new man and the new society. If in Emilio Gentile thinking, fascist ideology has a strong irrational component, He claims that this ideology is backed by a rational system of organization and institution. And Mosse similarly insisted on the role of educational institution in the diffusion of Völkisch ideology among German youth at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. As we just seen, Emilio Gentile highlighted the role of the party and the totalitarian state in the implementation of the anthropological revolution, contesting the idea of depolitization of the party in the 1930s. He believes that it contributed greatly to undermining the foundation of liberal state in order to build the totalitarian state. And between the party and the state, rather than identifying a confrontation, he detected a process of hybridization. A form of totalitarianism, Italian fascism, is also analyzed by Emilio Gentile as a political religion. Indeed, fascist ideology, integrating myths, rites, and symbols as a religious dimension. It was sacralized, imposed on Italians as a faith, and demanded obedience from them. And it pursued a major objective of an eschatological type, the regeneration of the human being. Conception of fascism as a political religion is, in Emilio Gentile framework, another argument to consider Italian fascism as a totalitarian regime. Third period, from the very end of the 20th century, fascism as totalitarianism, this is now from 30 years ago, this is a dominant reading, but there are persistent criticism. The works of George Mosse, Renzo De Felice, and Emilio Gentile have given a decisive impulse to the use of the concept of totalitarianism in historical research on Italian fascism since the 1980s and 1990s. Several elements of the political, ideological, and memorial context have also favored this evolution. On the ideological level, from the second half of the 1970s, the collapse of revolutionary myths and the decline of Marxism allowed the concept of totalitarianism to emerge from the ostracism to which it had been subjected since 1945. The fall of the communist regime in Europe in 1989-1991 further accentuated the use of the notion in academic circles. Second factor, in Italy, the political context, the political crisis caused by the Operation Clean Hands in the early 1990s led to a shake-up of the Republic and its ideological founding principle, anti-fascism. Political scientists and historians have identified the roots of the crisis in the party crisis and in the hegemony exercised over national power by the Christian Democratic Party, phenomena inherited from the totalitarian imprint left by fascism on post-war Italy. The crisis of the 1990s also gave rise to new political parties, including in the center and right and far right, Forza Italia, Lega Nord, the Northern League, and the Italian social movement Alliance, National Alliance, the party of Gianfranco Fini. These parties revised the fascist past to de-demonize it and underline and highlight its positive features: strengthening of a nation, modernization of economy, Mussolini as a great head of state, the aim of this party was to give a new legitimacy to the national idea that these parties wanted to substitute for anti-fascism as the foundation of the Republic. And for the Italian social movement, heir to fascism, The objective was also to legitimize its accession to power. Indeed, thus, in order to challenge this political reinterpretation of fascism and reestablish the historical truth, research on fascism, particularly in the field of political and cultural history, has tended to highlight the totalitarian dimension of fascism. Thus, many studies of the political history of fascism use totalitarianism as a category of analysis. They focus on fascist and state organization and institutions, like youth organization, the use of political violence by fascism, which has been reassessed. For instance, fascism included violence in a strategy for conquering power. Julia Banez has shown that the March on Rome thus introduced a break in using violence with the previous regime. Several studies have also shown the effectiveness of the repression deployed against anti-fascists. Totalitarian logic was also at work in the development of the doctrine and the adoption of anti-Semitic law rigorously applied by the administration in 1938, as shown Marianne Matar-Bonucci. The same totalitarian dynamic has been identified in several aspects of the colonial policy of fascism, violence and racism against indigenous population exercised from 1922 marks a break with the colonial policy of the previous regime. Then, in the end of the 20s, there was a massive repression in Libya, and after, in the second half of 1930s in Ethiopia, laws of racial segregation in Oriental Africa adopted in 1936-1937. The works on the Italian Social Republic, notably those of Claudio Pavone, have underlined the support that the regime had enjoyed among a section of the population, in particular the young men, ragazzi di Salo. They have also shown the ferocity of the repression perpetrated against the partisans and the complicity of the Social Republic in the persecution of the Jews. The same totalitarian dynamic has irrigated the foreign policy of fascism, development of project of vital space in the Mediterranean and Africa, policy of aggression and occupation during the war in Slovenia, in Balkan, etc. In cultural history, still in the line with the work of Mosse, De Felice and Emilio Gentile, research has studied the means of the consensus in the construction of totalitarianism, policy of conquest and control of intellectuals, cultural policies, major role of the ideology and myths, etc. On the theoretical level, the interpretation of fascism as totalitarianism is also shared by Roger Griffin. Like Mosse, the British historian has favored an analysis of fascism through ideology and culture. He has given a major role to the myth of the anthropological revolution, on which he bases his definition of fascism and which determines its totalitarian nature. Another group of historians, several historians of anti-fascist lineage, as Enzo Traverso, Enzo Colotti, grouped together in the same totalitarian category Italian fascism and Nazism, emphasizing the analogies. According to them, coming from a common matrix, the two regimes constructed a model of state of organization with the aim of imperialist expansion. However, this is the last point, some historians reject the analysis of fascism as totalitarianism, either because they consider the concept inappropriate for studying and understanding the functioning of a regime, or because they believe that the totalitarian dimension of fascism is questionable in light of incompleteness or even the failure of totalitarian construction. Thus, in the field of economic and social history, many studies that favor an approach of a society from below. Many studies highlight the inertia of Italian society, the weight of social conservatism, which they had thwarted the totalitarian project of the regime. In the same way, we can note that some social history studies on German society under Nazism, I think of the studies on everyday life of Martin Brosat and Mommsen, and in the social studies on Soviet society under Stalin. I think of the studies of revisionist school, historian of revisionist school as Sheila Fitzpatrick. In the same way, they have similarly privileged the autonomy of the social in relation to the political regime and questioned the totalitarian character of the two systems. Another criticism comes from the historian of the law Sabino Cassese, who published a book 10 years ago. The translation in France is 2014. Sabino Cassese has rejected the analysis of fascism as totalitarianism by means of three series of arguments. He first points out the continuities between liberal Italy and fascist regime. Second, he invokes the competition between several instances of power at local and regional levels. And third, he mentioned the failure of corporatism, determining the failure of a totalitarian transformation of society. While other historians acknowledge the existence of fascist totalitarian projects or intention, they also note the failure of a totalitarian construction, given the regime's inability to translate the project into a political practice. Evoking a failed and imperfect totalitarianism, they point out the obstacles that the regime encountered on the path to totalitarianism. These obstacles are the presence of a monarchy, the influence of the church, the compromises made with traditional elites, the passivity of Italians, etc. In conclusion, after being kept out the category of totalitarianism between 1945 and the 1960s, Italian fascism was gradually reintroduced in the category. Such a development was made possible by the influence of the work of George Mosse, disseminated in Italy by Renzo De Felice and Emilio Gentile. Another factor, the rise of historical research bringing to light aspects of fascism that had been ignored or underestimated until then, and the weight, third factor, of political and memorial context. Today, however, the debate about the classification of fascism as totalitarian regime remains open. One of the factors in the positioning of historians on the question concerns the field of study in which their research is situated, in one hand in political and cultural history, or in the other hand, or in economic and social history. Thank you.